There are empires that collapse because they are defeated. There are civilizations that fall apart because they run out of resources. But there is a question that makes history far more unsettling. How can a small, poor community, with no cities, no fortresses, no treasure, grow into an empire that dominates 3 continents and survives for more than 6 centuries? If you believe power always begins with gold, armies, or noble bloodlines, then the story you are about to hear will force you to rethink everything from the beginning. Imagine a frontier where the old order is rotting from the inside. The Byzantine Empire is weakening. Muslim principalities are fragmented. War breaks out like an everyday routine, and loyalties change with the seasons. In that place, nothing guarantees tomorrow. There is no promise of glory, no map outlining the future. And at that exact intersection of chaos, the Ottomans appear, not as an empire favored by fate, but as an unanswered question. They are not stronger than others. They are not richer than others. But they possess something many surrounding powers have already lost, a belief that their existence carries meaning beyond personal survival. Before the Ottomans had territory, they already had a story worth believing in. Before they had a mighty army, they already had a reason to fight. This was not a tale of conquest driven by pure ambition, but a sense of mission. That they stood on the boundary between order and chaos, between a world dying and a world not yet formed. When people believe they are serving something greater than themselves, they accept hardship without demanding immediate reward. That belief turned ordinary people into a community with extraordinary endurance. Welcome to Prophetic History Explained, where history is not only told, but examined, so we can understand why the past is still whispering to the present. And before we go deeper into the Ottoman journey, take a moment to subscribe and support the channel, so we can continue bringing you historical stories that are thoughtful, different, and deeply meaningful. The Ottomans were not born from a luxurious court or an imperial plan drawn in advance. They formed around a spiritual core. In a world where power was usually tied to bloodline and wealth, the Ottomans tied power to responsibility. The leader was not only a ruler, but a guardian of order, a guardian of community, and a guardian of shared belief. That fusion of political leadership and sacred purpose created a special kind of legitimacy. Legitimacy not rooted in a glorious past, but in a promise about the future. What is astonishing is that the Ottomans did not allow their ideals to become chains. They did not trap their mission inside rigid doctrine. Instead, they allowed reality to sharpen the way they existed. In their early phase, the Ottomans did not try to impose a fully formed identity. They were flexible, sometimes even ambiguous, and that very ambiguity gave them room to adapt. They learned to live with difference, not by erasing it, but by placing it inside a new order. This was the first sign that the Ottoman state was not built from stone and steel alone, but from the ability to redefine itself as circumstances changed. The Ottomans' early strength was not in their size, but in their direction. While many surrounding powers poured their energy into protecting old privileges, the Ottomans focused on building a community that believed it was part of a journey longer than a single lifetime. Each victory was not only territorial expansion, but reinforcement of a shared story. Each defeat was not the end, but a test of conviction. That is why the Ottomans did not collapse under early hardship, something history has seen again and again among young, fragile states. The beginning of the Ottoman story is not a shining, heroic epic, but a persistent whisper about meaning. A small community dared to believe it had a role in the order of the world, and that belief laid the first stone for an empire that would last for centuries. From that moment, history began moving along a new trajectory, where power was measured not only by land, but by the depth of belief. This is only the starting point. What the Ottomans would become and the price they would pay for endurance would be far more complex and far more haunting. An empire may be born from belief, but it can only survive through adaptation. This is where the Ottomans began to separate themselves from the short-lived fate of countless other states that rose and vanished in the same era. As the Ottomans expanded, they faced a major paradox of power. The more diverse the people they ruled, the greater the risk of fragmentation. Language, customs, faith, historical memory, everything collided. Most empires fail at this moment when they try to force diversity into a single mold. The Ottomans did not. Instead of coercive assimilation, the Ottomans chose a harder path, one more durable over time. Governing difference. They did not see diversity as a threat to eliminate, but as a reality to organize. This required a rare kind of flexibility. The Ottomans did not completely destroy existing structures in the territories they absorbed. They preserved local laws when possible, accommodated different religious communities, and allowed multiple ways of life to exist side by side within one political order. Central authority did not try to make everything identical. It tried to ensure differences did not become a destructive war. In this approach, the Ottomans revealed a mindset that feels surprisingly modern. They understood that stability does not come from everyone being the same, but from each group feeling it has a place within the whole. What mattered was not who you were, but whether you accepted the shared order. The Ottomans built a framework wide enough for multiple identities to exist, so long as those identities did not break the empire's foundation. This was not idealized tolerance. It was practical tolerance, forged through the experience of surviving on a chaotic frontier. Ottoman adaptability was also clear in the way they built the machinery of governance. Instead of relying entirely on bloodline or traditional aristocracy, they created new systems of selection and training that allowed the state to continually regenerate itself. This helped the Ottomans avoid one of power's inherited diseases: stagnation. While many dynasties became trapped by families, privilege, and lineage, the Ottomans allowed competence and loyalty to shape the structure of authority. The state was not locked into a single class. It could absorb new elements as circumstances changed. What is striking is that the Ottomans did not treat borrowing from other civilizations as weakness. They treated it as survival strategy. They adopted administrative techniques from earlier empires, adjusted law to fit social reality, and learned organizational models suited to each stage of development. They did not try to prove they were pure, because they understood that purity in politics often means fragility. An empire that lasts must transform without losing its core. That flexibility created an interesting paradox. The Ottomans had an identity, but it was not fixed. It moved like a current, keeping direction but changing shape when it met new terrain. Because of this, the Ottomans could rule vast lands with completely different environments, cultures, and histories without destroying existing order. The empire did not operate like a rigid block of stone. It operated like a living organism, constantly adjusting to maintain balance. But adaptability does not last automatically. It requires openness and institutions willing to learn. In this period of Ottoman history, that spirit was still alive. The state was not yet obsessed with defending old privilege. It was focused on keeping the machine of power functioning. Each new territory was not only conquered but integrated into a structure flexible enough to endure. Much of Ottoman endurance did not come from dramatic battles, but from the ability to keep order after victory. War can open the road to power, but only wise governance can hold it. The Ottomans understood that conquering land is a short-term act. Building an order that most people can live with is the long-term challenge. That focus helped them avoid the endless cycles of rebellion that drained so many empires before them. In this phase, the Ottomans expanded not only geography but self-definition. They became an empire not because everyone was the same, but because they learned how to live together in difference. This quiet foundation, rarely celebrated yet decisive, carried them into higher stages of power. And from here, history began planting a question that would later haunt the empire. Can a system built on flexibility remain flexible once it reaches the peak of power? When an empire enters its golden age, the most dangerous enemy is not outside. It is the illusion of its own strength. For the Ottomans, the height of power did not come simply when they held the most territory, but when they learned how to restrain power. This is a paradox many civilizations fail to recognize in time. Lasting strength is not infinite expansion, but the ability to limit oneself to preserve long-term order. The conquest of Constantinople is often remembered as a dazzling symbol of military power. But if we see it only as a strategic victory, we miss its deepest meaning. Constantinople was not just a city. It was the memory of Rome, the spiritual center of Eastern Christianity, the symbol of an old order that once shaped the Mediterranean world. When the Ottomans entered that city, they did not simply defeat an enemy. They inherited a legacy. Power was no longer the power of a border principality. It became global power, placed on the shoulders of those who now claim to inherit history itself. Yet what truly lifted the Ottomans to their peak was not the ability to conquer symbols, but the ability to govern them. The city was not destroyed. Its memory was not erased. It was restructured into the center of a new order. Religious communities continued to exist. Laws were adapted rather than imposed blindly. This was proof that the Ottomans had moved beyond instinctive power into conscious power. They began to understand that strength is not only forcing others to obey, but making them accept a new order as something they can live within. In that context, law and administration became the pillars of Ottoman power. The empire reached its most stable condition when law became stronger than individuals. The ruler was no longer seen as the absolute source of justice, but as the guardian of a system larger than himself. This created a fragile but effective balance. Personal authority was recognized, but could not cross the boundaries of shared order. When power is limited by law, it becomes less arbitrary, and therefore produces less resistance. In this era, the Ottomans governed not only territory, but the rhythm of imperial life. The administrative system functioned like an organized body, in which each part understood its role: taxation, military, courts, education. Everything was connected in a structure designed for long-term stability. And crucially, that order did not rest only on violence. It rested on predictability. People knew what was permitted, what was forbidden, and what consequences followed each action. In history, the ability to create that predictability is a sign of a mature state. Culture and art also reached a kind of maturity, not as shallow decoration, but as the way power interpreted itself. Architecture, scholarship, spiritual life reflected an empire that believed it had found its place in the world's order. A civilization confident enough does not need to constantly prove strength through war. It displays power through building, organizing, and preserving. The Ottomans were at their height not because they defeated the most enemies, but because they created a space where order could survive across generations. But within that very stability, a dangerous seed began to grow. When systems run smoothly, people confuse stability with permanence. Mechanisms once designed for flexibility harden into fixed forms. Power is controlled, but it also begins to protect itself. The Ottoman Golden Age carried a deep paradox. The success of building order created the risk that the empire would struggle to change when change became necessary. Ottoman history teaches an important lesson. Power reaches its peak when it knows how to step back to preserve balance. But from that peak, history quietly raises a question with no easy answer. Can an empire built on law and order continue to renew itself when that order becomes something it must protect at all costs? The answer would not appear immediately. It would follow the Ottomans for centuries like a silent shadow, waiting to become crisis. The decline of an empire rarely begins with a crash. It begins in silence when early warning signs are hidden beneath the glow of past glory. For the Ottomans, the most dangerous moment was not when external enemies grew stronger, but when the system that once produced strength stopped changing. The empire did not break in a storm. It wore down through prolonged fatigue. Power remained, but the spirit of adaptation weakened. The very mechanisms that once lifted the Ottomans now became barriers. What was once flexible began to harden. Institutions born to serve shared order shifted toward protecting their own interests. Power no longer flowed according to society's real needs. It revolved around preserving established privilege. When an empire enters this stage, it no longer asks, "What must we change?" It asks only, "How do we keep what we already have?" That is the moment history begins turning away. The fatigue of power was visible in the way reforms were treated. The Ottomans did not lack people who saw the problems. They did not lack proposals. But reforms often arrived too late, were watered down, or were strangled by interest groups that had learned to live inside the old structure. Even small changes were seen as threats. A system built to govern society became a defensive structure resisting the empire's own survival needs. When reform is no longer a natural instinct but an internal battle, decline has already taken root. Meanwhile, the outside world did not stand still. The global economy shifted. Technology transformed the nature of warfare. Political thinking crossed new thresholds. Models that once worked for centuries became obsolete in only a few decades. The Ottomans did not fall because they did not see change. They fell because the speed of change in the world far outpaced their ability to adjust. The gap grew until it could not be closed with half measures. The most tragic part is that the Ottomans still had strength, but no longer had flexibility equal to that strength. The empire still had armies, administration, vast lands, but those parts no longer worked together as smoothly as before. Power became heavy, slow, late in responding to crisis. When a system is accustomed to stability for too long, it loses the ability to take the risks required for renewal. And no risk is more dangerous than refusing to change in a world that keeps moving. Ottoman decline is not mainly a story of moral weakness or personal incompetence. It is a story of structure. People inside the system were not necessarily worse than their ancestors, but they were bound by networks of interest, rules, and fear of loss. When power becomes something to protect at all costs, it stops serving society and begins serving itself. And in that moment, the empire loses the deeper legitimacy that once formed its foundation. As time passed, the Ottomans fell into a defensive posture, not only against external enemies, but against the future itself. Every concession looked like defeat. Every change looked like betrayal of tradition. But tradition, when separated from its original purpose, becomes an empty shell. The Ottomans once succeeded because they dared to restructure the legacy of others into a new order. Now they could not restructure their own legacy. Flexibility once the empire's survival instinct became a memory. There is a bitter paradox here. The Ottomans did not fall because they changed too much, but because they could not change deeply enough. Surface reforms never reached the core. They patched the old system instead of recreating it. And when a living body treats symptoms without addressing causes, exhaustion becomes inevitable. History did not punish the Ottomans for a single mistake, but for a long chain of delayed choices. The most tragic part of decline was not territorial loss or fading power. It was that an empire that once understood adaptation lost faith that it could still adapt. When the ability to imagine a future is strangled, even great power becomes fragile. The Ottomans entered their final phase not as an empire completely defeated, but as a system exhausted after centuries of existence. And in that exhaustion, history prepared a transition that could not be reversed. Decline was no longer a question of whether it would happen, but how it would happen. The empire moved toward the moment every empire eventually faces, when the past can no longer support the present and the future demands a new form entirely. When an empire reaches its end, history often describes it with heavy words like collapse, disintegration, or failure. But if we see the Ottoman ending only through that lens, we miss its deepest meaning. The end of the Ottoman Empire was not like a building being demolished. It was like an aging organism closing a life cycle after fulfilling its role. The empire did not vanish into nothingness. It transformed, leaving layers that continued shaping the world afterward. The Ottomans reached the end when the imperial structure no longer fit the modern age. But that does not mean everything they created became worthless. On the contrary, many foundations of modern states in former Ottoman lands were built from Ottoman legacy. Administrative systems, large-scale governance experience, the management of multi-religious and multi-ethnic societies. These things did not disappear with the empire. They were reshaped, simplified, or transferred into new forms suited to the new century. This transition was not gentle. It came with loss, conflict, and deep rupture. For many people living through that moment, the fall of the empire felt like the loss of a familiar world, even if that world had grown heavy and outdated. But history rarely allows humans to choose comfort over necessity. When a structure can no longer adapt, its dissolution becomes the condition for a new order to appear. The Ottomans could no longer remain an empire, but the most essential parts of them continued living in another form. Everything depends on how we understand an ending. If we see the Ottoman fall as total failure, we learn almost nothing. But if we see it as completion, we begin to see a deeper historical rule. No civilization lasts forever in the same shape. The civilizations that endure are not immortal. They endure because they leave structures strong enough to be inherited. The Ottomans connected East and West, preserved order for centuries, and when the imperial form was no longer viable, they left space for a new form to arise. In that final moment, the Ottoman Empire was like an ancient tree. The trunk may rot. The branches may break, but the roots have grown deep into the ground. Those roots are historical memory, experience in governance, lessons about power and its limits. They continue feeding new realities rising from the same soil. The birth of modern states after the empire was not a total rejection of the past, but the result of a painful process of distillation. From the Ottoman story, history delivers a difficult message. Greatness is not measured by how long you exist, but by how you end. An empire can conquer half the world and leave only ruins, or it can dissolve and still leave foundations for the future. The Ottomans, with all their contradictions and limits, ended closer to the second path, even if not always by intention. They did not control every factor of their ending. But what they left behind was too large to be erased from history. And this lesson goes beyond the Ottomans. Any system, whether a nation, an organization, or a personal life, faces the same question. When a cycle ends, what do you leave behind? History remembers not only winners, but how they let go. An ending in chaos can destroy generations. An ending that transforms can open the road to renewal. The Ottoman story reminds us that power is not the final goal. The deeper measure of success is whether you leave an order that can continue living. When we look back on the entire Ottoman journey, we no longer see an empire that refused to die, but a civilization that lived out its full life cycle. It was born from mission, grew through adaptation, reached its peak through order, declined by losing the ability to renew, and ended in an inevitable transformation. History here does not speak with condemnation, but with warning. Nothing is eternal, but everything has meaning when placed correctly within the flow of time. The Ottomans left the stage as an empire, but their story continues to echo as a reminder. The civilizations that accept their own ending are often the ones that leave the deepest mark. The lesson for us today is clear. In modern life, whether you are building a nation, an organization, or your own personal path, success is not clinging to power, position, or old habits at all costs. True success is the ability to ask, what must be preserved, what must be changed, and when must one stage end so another can begin? Like the Ottomans, each of us moves through cycles: birth, growth, decline, transformation. The wise person is not the one who avoids change, but the one who steps into it with awareness and responsibility. If you want to keep exploring history through a deeper lens, where the past is not merely narrated but connected to the present and the future, join the Prophetic History Explained community. Together we explore empires, civilizations, figures, and historical patterns that have shaped the world we live in. And do not forget to subscribe and support the channel so we can continue producing high-quality, thoughtful, and distinctive content in future videos.